It's strange how life can turn out so different from what you imagined. You start with dreams big and small and utri. Your best to stay on the path. You tell yourself it'll all work out because you've done the right things. You pick the right man, the right life, the right choices, but then somewhere along the way, things start to shift slowly, quietly, and before you know it, you're standing in the middle of a life you don't quite recognize. Let me tell you how it all started. His name is James. We met when I was 22, fresh out of college, and just starting my first job as a nurse at the local hospital in Austin, Texas. James was a mechanic at a garage not far from my apartment. I wasn't looking for love. I was focused on my new career, trying to prove myself in a tough world. But James, she had this warmth about him, like the world was a little softer wherever he was. He didn't try too hard or act like someone he wasn't. He was just James, and I fell for him. Those early days were like something out of a movie. He would surprise me at work with lunch always, remembering my favorite sandwich, turkey on rye with extra pickles. I'd leave little notes in his toolbox. Silly things, like "you make me smile" or "don't work too hard." We couldn't keep our hands off each other. I'm not just talking about sex, though that was incredible too. It was the way he'd hold my hand when we walked, the way he'd brushed my hair off my face. When he kissed me, he made me feel seen. We got married a year later. The ceremony was small, but perfect. Just close friends and family at a park by the lake. I remember standing under that oak tree, looking into his eyes as we said our vows, feeling like I had hit the jackpot. I thought, this is it. This is my forever. For a while, it was everything I'd hoped for. We moved into a cozy little house, the kind with a front porch swing and just enough room for the kids we planned to have someday. James worked hard, putting in long hours at the garage, while I worked the night shift at the hospital. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like more than enough. But life has a way of wearing you down, doesn't it? The long hours turned into even longer weeks. The bills piled up. And so did the stress. James started coming home tired. Too tired to talk. Too tired to hold me the way he used to. I told myself it was just a phase, that things would get better once we settled into a routine. And for a while I believed it, but then the cracks started to show. At first it was little things. He stopped bringing me lunch at work, then oats I left in his toolbox went unnoticed. We'd go days without really talking, just passing each other like strangers in our own home. And then there was the bedroom. That's where the cracks turned into canyons. James used to be different, passionate, attentive. He made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world, but over time things changed. He'd come to bed late, exhausted, and when we did manage to make love, it was over, almost as soon as it began. 2 minutes, sometimes less. I tried to be understanding. I told myself he was just stressed, that he'd find his way back to him eventually. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, I started to lose hope. I remember the first time I cried about it. It was a Tuesday night. James had fallen asleep on the couch, Hagen, and I was sitting in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I wanted to shake him awake and scream, "Don't you see me? Don't you care?" But I didn't. I just turned off the light and cried myself to sleep. That's the thing about marriage. They don't tell you how lonely it can get. You're supposed to be team, but what happens when one of you stops showing up for the game? What happens when the person who's supposed to be your everything becomes just another part of the background? I held on as long as I could. I told myself that love was about sacrifice, about sticking it out even when it hurt. But deep down I was starving for something more, for someone to look at me the way James used to, for someone to remind me that I was still alive, still desirable, still worth something. And that's when it happened. That's when I made the choice that would change everything. But I'm not ready to talk about that yet, not just yet. For now, I just want you to know where I was coming from. I want you to understand that I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray my husband. It wasn't some cold, calculated decision. It was the result of years of feeling invisible, of begging for something that never came. It was the choice of a woman who was desperate to feel loved again. But love, as I would soon learn, doesn't always come without a press, they say. Temptation comes softly, like a whisper in the wind for me. It came in the form of a man named David Emmett Kim. At the hospital where I worked, he wasn't a doctor and he wasn't a patient. He was one of the IT guys there to fix some network issue in our department. I wouldn't have noticed him at all if he hadn't struck up a conversation while waiting for his system to reboot. "You look like you've had a long day," he said with a warm smile, his voice cutting through the hum of monitors and soft beeping of machines. I laughed more out of politeness than amusement. "Long shift," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. But David wasn't the type to give up easily. Over the next few weeks, he seemed to pop up everywhere. The cafeteria, the staff lounge, even the elevator. He had this way of making small talk feel effortless, like he genuinely cared about what you had to say at first. I thought nothing of it, a little harmless flirting. I told myself, nothing more. But it wasn't harmless. Not for me. It started with little things. David would bring me coffee during my breaks, always remembering how I liked it, black with just a splash of cream. He'd ask about my day, listen to me vent about work, and somehow always managed to make me laugh, even when I didn't feel like smiling. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, and that scared me. I tried to pull back to put some distance between us. I stopped sitting in the cafeteria during my breaks and started eating in my car instead. I avoided the staff lounge and took the stairs instead of the elevator. But no matter how hard I tried, David always found a way to slip past my defenses. "You're avoiding me," he said one day, cornering me in the hallway after I'd hurried past him for the third time. That week, did I do something wrong? I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "It's not you. I need some space, that's all." But David wasn't. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if I've overstepped, I'm sorry. I just like talking to you. That's all." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could just be friends, that the connection I felt with him didn't have to mean anything more. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was already in too deep. The first time it happened, it was almost an accident, at least. That's what I told myself. We were both working late, and the hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost eerie. I was sitting in the lounge going over some paperwork when David walked in. He didn't say anything at first. Just grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and sat down across from me. "You look tired," he said, his voice soft. Inaudible, not trusting myself to speak while we just sat there in silence. And then out of nowhere he reached across the table and took my hand in his. He should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything to stop what was happening. But I didn't. I just sat there, letting his warmth seep into me, feeling void I hadn't even realized was there. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he said, as if reading my mind. "Sometimes people just need someone to lean on," but it did mean something. It meant everything from that moment on. Everything changed. It started finding excuses to stay late at work, to spend more time with David. We'd sneak away during breaks, stealing moments that felt like stolen treasure. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. For the first time in years, I felt alive, but the guilt was always there, lurking in the background like a shadow. I couldn't escape. Every time I came home to James, every time I kissed him goodnight, I felt like a monster. He didn't deserve this. He was a good man, a kind man. The kind of man who would move mountains for the people he loved, but he wasn't enough for me anymore, and that realization broke something inside me. It tried to justify it to myself. I told myself that James had failed me first, that he was the one who had let our marriage fall apart. But deep down, I knew that wasn't fair. He was doing the best he could, even if it wasn't enough. One night, as I lay in bed next to James, listening to his soft snores, I found myself praying for the first time in years. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for some kind of sign that I wasn't completely lost. But most of all, I prayed for James. I prayed that he would find his way back to me, that he would become the man he used to be, the man I fell in love with, because the truth was, I didn't want to be this person. I didn't want to be a woman who cheated on her husband, who lied and betrayed the one person who'd always been there for her. I wanted to stop. I wanted to fix what was broken between us, but I didn't know how. And so I did the only thing I could. I kept pretending that everything was fine, that I was still the loving, faithful wife James thought I was. And all the while I kept hoping, praying that something would change, that James would change, that I could find a way to save us before it was too late. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cracks in our marriage had grown too wide, and I wasn't sure if they could ever be mended when it finally happened. It wasn't planned, at least not consciously, but if I'm being honest, some part of me knew it was coming. You don't play with fire and expect not to get burned. David and I had been dancing around the line for weeks. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the room. It was all leading up to this moment, and I let it. I wanted it. It happened on a Friday night. I had just finished a double shift at the hospital, my body aching and my mind a blur. David was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against his car with that easy, confident smile that always made my heart skip a beat. "You look exhausted," he said. As I approached, "Long day," I replied, my voice heavy with fatigue. "Come on," he said, opening the passenger door. "Let me take you out for a drink. You need to unwind." I hesitated for a moment, torn between what I wanted and what I knew was right. But the thought of going home to another night, of James falling asleep on the couch, of lying in bed, feeling more alone than ever, was too much to bear. "Okay," I said, climbing into the car. We drove to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one would recognize us over the next couple of hours. We talked and laughed, like wheelways did, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. I could feel it in the way his hand brushed against mine when he reached for his drink, in the way his eyes lingered on my lips when I spoke. By the time we left, I was buzzing. Not just from the wine, but from the way David made me feel alive. "Desired scene, I don't want to go home yet," I said as we stood by his cart, the cool night air wrapping around us. "Then don't he?" replied his voice, low and inviting. I knew what he meant, I knew what he was offering, and for the first time in years I let myself say yes. We drove to a hotel a few miles away. The silence between us thick with anticipation. My heart was pounding as we walked into the room, my body trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. I had never done anything like this before. I had never cheated on my husband. But in that moment, all I could think about was how much I needed him. David didn't rush. He took his time, his hands and lips, exploring every inch of me like he was memorizing a map. He made me feel beautiful, cherished, and most of all, desired. When we finally came together, it was everything I had been craving. And more. He lasted longer than James ever had, his touch igniting parts of me that I had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in years, I felt truly satisfied, not just physically but emotionally afterward. As we lay tangled in the sheets, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, sadness. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and while part of me regretted it, another part felt like I had finally taken back a piece of myself that I had lost. "You deserve to be happy," David said softly, his fingers tracing circles on my bare shoulder. "I don't know what I deserve anymore," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled me closer, his warmth soothing the itch in my chest. "All I know is that you don't have to do this alone." But I was alone even in that moment with David's arms around me. I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had betrayed James, the man who had loved me through everything, who had never once questioned my loyalty, and for what a few hours of pleasure, a temporary escape from the emptiness that had taken root in my marriage when I finally made it home that night. James was asleep on the couch, the television still flickering. With some late-night infomercial, I stood there for a moment watching him. My heart heavy with guilt, he looked so peaceful. So unaware of the storm raging inside me, I wanted to wake him up, to tell him everything, to beg him to fight for us. But I didn't have the courage to face what I had done, to confront the reality of the mess I had made. So, instead, I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you," even though I wasn't sure if it was still true. As I climbed into bed that night, I prayed harder than I ever had before. I prayed for James to get better, to find his way back to the man he used to be. I prayed for the strength to let go of David, to stop this madness before it destroyed me. But most of all, I prayed for forgiveness for James, for David, and for myself. The next morning, James woke up early and made me breakfast. He didn't say anything about the night before, didn't ask where I'd been or why I come to bed so late. He just handed me a plate of scrambled eggs and toast and kissed me on the cheek like nothing had changed, but everything had changed, and I wasn't sure if I could ever put the pieces back together after that night with David. Everything felt different. It wasn't just the guilt, it was the way I started looking at my life, at my marriage, at James. It was as if I had crossed an invisible threshold and couldn't find my way back. David and I didn't stop after that first time. One night turned into 2, then 3. And before I knew it, we were meeting every week. Each time I told myself it would be the last, that I would find the strength to say no. But every time I gave in, he made me feel things James hadn't in years, not just in bed, but in every little way. He listened. He touched me like I was precious, and he didn't rush with David. It wasn't just about the physical act, it was about feeling wanted again. The way he held me, the way he whispered my name when we were together, made me forget, even if just for a moment, that I was someone's wife. And in those moments I felt alive, but the guilt never left me. It was always there, a constant shadow, following me home, sitting with me at dinner, lying between James and me in bed. James, bless him, didn't have a clue. He was still the same kind, loving man I had married, still trying in his own quiet way to make me happy, but his efforts, though sweet, only made the guilt worse. He started coming to bed earlier, trying to make love to me more often, but it was always the same, quick, unfulfilling, and over before I could even catch my breath. I tried to hide my disappointment, but I think he could sense it. Did I do something wrong? He asked one night after another. Failed attempt at intimacy. I shook my head, forcing a smile. No, of course not. You're perfect. But he wasn't perfect, at least not in the way I needed him to be, and the fact that he was trying so hard only made me feel more like a monster. David, on the other hand, was everything James wasn't. He lasted longer. He knew how to touch me, how to make me feel things I thought I had lost forever. He didn't just satisfy me physically. He ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years with him. I felt alive, whole, like a woman again, but the more time I spent with him, the more I started to realize that what we had wasn't sustainable. One afternoon, as we lay tangled in the sheets of yet another hotel room, David turned to me and said, "I wish I could keep you all to myself." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You know that's not possible," I said, avoiding his gaze. "But what if it could be?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "What if you left him? We could start over, just you and me." I sat up, pulling the sheet around me like armor. "Don't do this, David. Don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not trying to make it harder," he said, sitting up beside me. "I'm just saying what we both know is true. You're not happy with him. You haven't been for a long time. Why keep pretending because he's my husband? Because I made vows, because no matter how much I've messed up, I can't just throw away the life we built. together, but I didn't say any of that instead. I just shook my head. It's not that simple. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. It could be if you let it. I didn't. Respond I couldn't. Because deep down, he knew he was right. I wasn't happy with James, and I hadn't been for a long time, but leaving him, that felt like a betrayal on a whole different level. When I got home that night, James was waiting for me in the kitchen, a worried look on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked as I walked through the door. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Why, you've just been different lately," he said, his brow furrowed. "Distant." "I don't know. I just feel like something's off." I wanted to tell him the truth. Right then and there, too, lay it all out and beg for his forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just said, "I'm fine. Work's just been stressful, that's all." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. "If there's something going on, you can tell me. You know I'm here." I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but I didn't tell him I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of what I had done, of what I was still doing that night as I lay in bed next to James. I felt more alone than ever. I wanted to stop seeing David, to put an end to the affair and focus on rebuilding what I had with James, but every time I thought about ending things, I felt a pang of sadness, like I was losing a part of myself. The truth was, I didn't know how to let go of David. He had become my escape, my refuge from the emptiness that had taken over my marriage, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living this double life. Sooner or later, something had to give. As I closed my eyes that night, I found myself praying again. "God, please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, "help me find a way out of this. Help James get better, help us." I didn't know if my prayers would be answered, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. The day I finally spoke to James about his condition was one of the hardest days of my life. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head 1,000 times, trying to find the right words to say, the right way to bring up something so personal without crushing him. But when the moment came, it wasn't nearly as polished as I had imagined. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the silence between us heavier than usual. He was scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the screen, and I was staring at my empty plate, mustering up the courage to speak. "James," I said finally, my voice trembling, "can we talk?" He looked up, his brows furrowing in concern. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately, about the way things have changed." He set his phone down, his full attention now on me. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, my fingers gripping the edge of the edible. "I mean, in the bedroom." His face fell, and I immediately hated myself for bringing it up. "Oh," he said, quietly, looking down at his hands. "No, I haven't been what you need." "It's not about that," I said quickly, though Weboth knew it was. "I just think maybe there's something going on. Something medical. Maybe you should talk to a doctor." He was silent for a long time, and I could see the shame written all over his face. "I've thought about it," he admitted finally. I don't know. It's embarrassing." "There's nothing to be embarrassed about," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I love you, James. I just want us to be happy, to be whole again." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll go true to his word." James made an appointment the very next day. The doctor ran a series of tests and confirmed that his condition was likely due to a combination of stress, poor diet, and some underlying hormonal imbalances. He was prescribed medication and given a list of lifestyle changes to implement: exercise, a healthier diet, and better sleep habits. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this could be the turning point for us, maybe. We could finally get back to what we once had. But change doesn't happen. Overnight the medication helped. But the improvement was slow. Instead of 1 or 2 minutes, he could now last 3. It was progress. But it wasn't. Enough not yet. And I could see the frustration in his eyes every time we tried, the way he apologized afterward. As if he was solely responsible for the distance between us. "It's getting better," he said one night. His voice filled with forced optimism. "The doctor said it'll just take time." "I know," I said, stroking his hair as Harris did his head on my chest. "We'll get there." But as much as I wanted to believe, that part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if we didn't? What if this was as good as it was going? Could I live with that? Could I stay faithful? Knowing that part of me would always feel unfulfilled. I had ended things with David weeks ago, but the memory of him still lingered. I found myself thinking about him at odd moments, when I was folding laundry, when I was driving home from work, even when I was lying next to James. I missed the way he made me feel, the way he had awakened something in me that I didn't even know was still there, but I couldn't go back. I wouldn't, no matter how much I missed him. I knew that going back to David would only make things worse. So I threw myself into our marriage, trying to focus on the things that still connected us. I started cooking healthier meals for James, going on walks with him in the evenings, and finding little ways to remind him that I loved him, and I did love him. That was the one thing I was sure of. But love, as I had learned, wasn't always enough. One night, as we lay in bed, after another failed attempt at intimacy, James turned to me and said, "Thank you for sticking with me." I forced a smile, my chest tight with the weight of everything. I wasn't saying "you're my husband." I said simply, "I'm not going anywhere," and I meant it, for now at least. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself growing restless. The improvement was so slow, and the gaps between us still felt so wide. I kept telling myself to be patient, to give the medication and lifestyle changes more time to work. But the question I had been avoiding kept creeping into the back of my mind. How long could I wait? How long could I go on like this before I started looking for satisfaction elsewhere again? I didn't have an answer, and that terrified me. Every night I prayed for strength. I prayed for James to get better, for our marriage to heal, for the emptiness inside me to finally go away. But as much as I wanted to believe that everything would work out, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of mystery, that there was another chapter waiting to be written, a chapter I wasn't sure I wanted to face. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I whispered a silent prayer. "Please," I said, my voice barely audible. "Please help me stay. Please help me hold on." But deep down, I knew that the future was uncertain, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if love would be enough.